Hello and welcome to Redwood Wonk. I'm your host tonight, Dave Frank, and I am joined by my co-host, Aaron Donaldson. Thanks for joining us this week, Aaron. I appreciate it.
It's great to be back on the show. Thanks for having me, David.
Our first issue we're going to deal with this week is the 9/11 20-year anniversary. Eric and I spoke about it a little bit last week, but there's been celebrations, remembrances, festivities, or reflection over the weekend, which kind of leads. There's new content for us, and we'll get your voice on this too. Just because it's such a pivotal and historic event in our nation's history. A whole generation of people grew up. That's their new reality. So, the high level bullet points from what I basically, the way I see it is, we have a legacy issues that still need to be dealt with. For example, the fact that we went into war in Iraq under these false pretenses, the fact that we went into Afghanistan in this perpetual beyond the scope of our original foreign policy goal approach. So that's something that I feel like we haven't really fully adjudicated in the public sphere, but also other things that people maybe don't always reflect on. Like, for example, that the Saudi government involvement and the United States efforts at the highest levels to not mention them, to cover up their involvement. So I'm going to ask you your opinion about that, but also one other sort of thing that kind of gets brushed under the rug periodically is, what was the U.S. response immediately after the events? And so I heard a lot of people speaking and writing, and heard them speak, saw them write over the weekend about how Wall Street and conservatives pushed through tax cuts in the 48 hours afterwards. And also in the week or two afterwards, many companies started rewarding their senior leadership with stock options based on the plummeting economy. It gave them a great opportunity to enrich themselves. And the term I heard used was sort of pillage their corporate coffers because they could. So there's some controversial, small ball stuff, but also some huge issues. How about you, Aaron? Like, what are some of the things you've reflected on, or maybe speak about some of the things I reflected on as we look back over the 20-year period?
Yeah, Naomi Klein famously talks about like disaster capitalism, and very few disasters are more profitable for capitalist states than the state of war. And that is exactly what America declared as soon as 9/11 happened. It was on the front page of the New York Times the day after, before we even knew who was responsible. We had already declared it a state of war. Valerie Carr speaks in her new book, See No Stranger, about the immediate backlash on Arab and Muslim-looking Americans and how many of them were subjected to hate and, in fact, violence. People were shot, people were stabbed, people were beaten just for wearing turbans, just for looking as though they might have been responsible. Again, all long before we knew who was responsible for this. I think it really shows America, what we're all about. We talk a lot about never forget, and in rhetoric classes we talk about what language does and what we're supposed to remember with 9/11 and what we're supposed to actually forget with 9/11. And now when we say never forget, we're supposed to forget that, it's been 20 years, millions and millions and millions of dollars a day. A million people have been killed. A million more have been displaced. The Taliban is right back in power, as I spoke about last time that I was here. We've lost over $1 trillion, according to the Pentagon. They have lost $1 trillion with a T, and that's hard to wrap your brain around. I tell folks a million seconds is 11 days. A billion seconds is 31.7 years. A trillion seconds is 31,700 years. The math is right on that. You can look it up. A trillion seconds is 31,000 years, and we've lost $1 trillion in Afghanistan. That is mind-boggling. When we talk about never forget, I talk about how 18,000 people a year die in this country from preventive disease. That's 9/11 6 times every year, but we're not supposed to remember that with 9/11. We spend $400 billion new dollars every year since on warfare. That's the exact same dollar amount that it would cost to have preventive health care for everyone in this country. One of my professors at the University of Denver, Dr. Wood, points out that when 9/11 happened, the most selfish the most selfish city in the country, New York, came to a complete stop, and absolute strangers ran towards burning and indeed collapsing buildings, sacrificing themselves to save strangers they've never known. This was done on an order of magnitude that is really difficult to understand. And yet 12 terrorists defined that day. When we say never forget, yeah, we talk about the sacrifice of first responders and things, but we think of it as a terrorist attack first and not the largest humanitarian effort that the world has witnessed in real time. It shows us who we are. We're a country bent on war. We're a country prepared to do everything we can to push our interests abroad, and we'll use any opportunity possible to jump on that and do that. And that's the legacy of 9/11.
Yeah, I mean, you point out a lot of interesting facts that I like even with Eric last week, I said we could just run off into, huge detail in many of these things. But so you definitely pointed out the disaster capitalism element and also the humanitarian side of how people really did come together and really did accomplish amazing things that day. One other thing about that day itself, which I think is, people sort of forget. You say never forget. People tend to forget. And there were some recently leaked documents just came out, I think, over the weekend about the 9/11 Commission. One of the things that they decided they weren't going to ask about or investigate are the very large number of firefighters who testified that they heard explosions. It's a pretty big number. It's the majority of the firefighters in this one set of interviews that, again, I don't know how publicly available this is. I'm sure they didn't want these documents leaked, but there's firsthand testimony that there ought to be a little more investigation. And I hate to bring it up. I know it's such a sore subject for folks about inside job this and inside job that. But the truth is that there are, many hundreds or thousands of structural engineers who've gone on the record as saying that they thought that there ought to be another look at it. And I actually once did a show, Professor Daniela Ganser from Switzerland. He goes on in great detail about conspiracy. What is a conspiracy? And a conspiracy is just when two people make a plan, they talk about it, they do it. That's a conspiracy. So the word should not be as loaded as it is. But I was just curious, your thoughts on the couple of those things. A couple of the elements about some strange investment patterns also came up. How a lot of folks sort of timed some very low probability investments around that time, around the days, and we can go on and on. I might as well, while we're at it, while the wounds are raw and wide open. If you do watch one of the 8,000 documentaries about that day, most of them are going to mention the fact that the air defense system was doing a full-blown mobilization that day. Everybody was sort of out of position. Everybody was assuming that all the new information they received, air traffic controllers and Air National Guard folks and many pieces of the security infrastructure was planning a game day that day for maneuvers and so people didn't really take that new information thinking that there was the catastrophe. And I don't mean to make light of it. I don't it's not something that I typically talk about publicly, but this is the time to talk about it. I'm saying unfinished business. And what are your thoughts on some of that unfinished business?
Well, it's a good point. We spent more on investigating the impacts of legalized gambling in this country than we did on 9/11, and that's fishy. And I don't think you have to necessarily believe that it's like a straight up CIA inside job to say that that's very weird, that one of the largest criminal scenes in American history was cleaned up as quickly as it was with so little investigation into what happened. And we can spend all day talking about how this takes us into wild and fringy places, but there's a wonderful Democracy Now! Interview with the individuals who created that now basely discredited documentary Loose Change, where they talk about how the conspiracy discourses take us away from the very legitimate things that we do know, which is that war profiteers envisioned this and saw this, and many people believe are responsible for this. You mentioned Saudi Arabia as a country that's very sympathetic to United States war efforts across the world, as a country that is involved. And in fact, Barbara Lee, who was the single House of Representative member to vote no on the authorization for violence. She was the only person was interviewed on Democracy Now! Yesterday, and she was talking about how we need investigations into things like these, into torture, into what started the war and why we started the war. I think that when we go into jet fuel can't melt steel beams, which is just non-responsive and utterly fantastic in terms of what's going on with the actual known events, you lose track of those very credible investigations that should happen. Again, 1 million people killed, millions displaced, $1 trillion lost. This was a very destructive event in our history that deserves a better understanding.
Yeah, and I appreciate your insights on that. And this is something that maybe we'll pick up another time.
Today, we celebrate the triumph not of a candidate, but of a cause, the cause of democracy.
We are going to raise issues that, historically have not been raised.
What about the nuclear option, doing away with the filibuster? I can tell you that would be the end of the Senate as it was originally devised.
All of this is possible for America. Who was standing in the way? Mitch McConnell.
Where an insurrection that sought to overturn an election, when that failed, the action moved into state capitals.
All right, we are going to move on to our second topic for today, which is the never-ending story on the $3.5 trillion budget reconciliation bill and its accompanying $1.5 trillion bipartisan infrastructure bill. And where does this stand? One of the headlines I think that our incremental progress in this conversation, and as this works its way through, is that the way where we left off last week in the continuing story was there's this standoff between within the Democratic Party between the establishment folks and the progressives, and is there enough? I think you called it. Somebody I talked to recently called it a standoff, like a game of chicken. So who blinks first? Exactly. The last I heard from Bernie Sanders was he said that Senator Manchin's position is, unacceptable. Just flat out dismissive and unacceptable. We don't delay for the sake of delay. We're going to talk about these things on the merits. If there's a policy or a proposal in any of these budgets that you don't want, you tell us why. And let's look at them. Policy is what we ought to be looking at, not just like, well, it's too big of a number. Especially because when you divide it up, like I talked about last week, when you divide up $3.5 trillion by 10 years of the budget window, and it's $350 billion, that's half. That's less than half of what we spend on the military. So it's not like it's this. The quicksand that if you even mention the number 3.5 trillion, society as we know it disappears into the debt abyss, to mix metaphors. So there's that element of it, which just means like maybe we ought to be realistic. And so what I had said last week is if there were a 30% cut, if Manchin was like, look, I know we're going to cut X amount. We just need to do this, and this, and they're able to come to terms. They're able to make it work. That's still that's $100 billion they cut per year for 10 years. That's $1 trillion. Now it's a win-win, a potential win-win. And then Manchin could say, look, I held the line as much as I could. We cut $1 trillion out. That's the best we could do, and everybody gets a pass on some amazing transformative policies that are social improvements, structural improvements, technology. Fighting climate change. There's a whole slew of things in this bill. It's a massive bill. So that said, what are your thoughts on where we stand now in this kind of standoff?
Well, my prediction, as you recall, is that I did think that the progressive Democrats are going to blink first. I think that they're going to have to. I think that if they don't pass something by early October, then it's going to obviously be terrible for the Democrats as a party, but it's going to implicate the nation as a whole. We start seeing like moving towards economic stoppages and things like that for the government, budget stoppages and stuff like that. So the fact of the matter is that the Democrats are a center right-leaning party, and that they just do not have the spine top to bottom to get behind the kinds of expansions that we're talking about. Universal pre-K 3 to 4-year-olds, free community college, increase in Pell Grants, federal paid and medical leave benefits, extending the child care tax, ACA subsidy enhancements, shifting our 50%, decreasing 50% emissions, and shifting our U.S. power grid to 80% 40% to emission free by 2030. This is really ambitious stuff that is obviously coming from the progressive wing of the party. And because they have reconciliation, they feel like they can push this through. The problem is, as you note, many in the party, Sinema, Manchin, the individual from Massachusetts whose name is escaping me right now, these are folks that are just going to tread water until after the midterm election. They can't afford to be on the hook for that much money. And as you've noted, they've all said, let's wait. The election tax stuff, the tax stuff, the election stuff is all stuff we want to make sure we understand. And this really plays into the kind of Republican talking point that Democrats are just ramming this whole thing through the system. Reconciliation, according to the New York Times, is an arcane process. That's the word they used. It goes way back. It's definitely not something brand new that no one's ever used before. And, we just finished talking about 1 trillion seconds is 31,000 years. But the difference between war spending and this spending is that the Democrats have a very strong footing to say that when we decrease healthcare costs, when we stimulate the economy through things like childcare and just basic preventive medicine, like you should have dental coverage with Medicare. Like that is a no-brainer. Your teeth are an internal and immediate systemic link to your whole body being healthy. And the fact that Medicare doesn't cover dental costs us a tremendous amount of money. And so rather than money just being lost on Humvees that don't go anywhere or that ultimately fall into the hands of the Taliban when we leave, or that don't stop IEDs because the shield on the bottom doesn't fit to the Humvee, it's like this is stuff that brings immediate and meaningful value to the United States economy. And as you said, 3.5 trillion over this period of time, when we know where it goes and what it stimulates, is worthwhile. It's absolutely worth it. I just don't think the Democrats are going to be able to stomach it. I think that they're more likely to just tread water and push off as long as they can. And I think I hope you're right. I hope 30% is all it takes. But the fact of the matter is they could cut it 60, 70%. And then the question is, will the progressives shut down the United States budget for this? And the answer is no, they won't. I don't think they will. So I think that they're kind of over a barrel, as it were.
Two of the elements you mentioned, I'm going to pick up on. So one of them is, or at least you alluded to. I don't know if you actually said it because you're on point, man. You're rattling things off. But there's the budget shutdown. There's the debt ceiling, which is anachronistic at best and problematic at worst, because this is money that's already been allocated, and that means it's going to be spent. So Congress passes the budget, and they say we're going to spend this amount of money on all this stuff, but then they somehow put an artificial cap on it periodically so that they could have this horrible moment of standoff about whether they're going to extend it or not. And just as a practical matter, nobody's going to let the U.S. government's good faith and credit of paying its debt service falter.
We've come close.
Yeah,
we've come very close in the past.
There are a lot of gimmicks, things that they could do. I heard Janet Yellen, talking about some of the reserve funds that she has access to as Treasury Secretary, and the capacity to extend beyond the formal deadline exists. So there's that one element of it is can they take it to the brink and then a little bit over? And the answer is yes. I don't think they're going to just risk at this time complete collapse by shutting down the government. So I like you said, I don't think there's going to be a shutdown. And then one of the other things that you said is just, all of those programs, all of those things that are in there that are potentially going to be additive to the well-being and health of not just the country writ large, but individual people. If you take a reflection of your own life, your own family, the cost of extended care for health, not just vision and dental and hearing, but also the long-term care type thing. That these are all under the current Medicare plan. People pay 20% off the top of all bills, and all the things I just mentioned aren't covered at all, basically, or effectively not covered at all. So that's why it's the number one cause of bankruptcy in our country. And that's just one element of it. When you look at climate change and all the things around drought and fire and increased natural disasters and just mitigating climate change itself, that's another huge major concern for folks. So what I heard from some of the progressives fairly recently is that they wanted 6 trillion. Mm-hmm. And this is not 6 trillion. This is 3.5 trillion. So they've cut it back to their bargaining position. And one of the things that they have to their advantage is that I think Senator Schumer and Speaker Pelosi and President Biden, they're all on the same page in terms of it's time. This is the window, because in 2022 they could lose control. Typically, there's a massive swing in the other direction against the White House each midterm cycle. That's likely to happen again, all things being equal. So this is a very short window, and the country, moreover, the country is in relatively dire straits compared to where we wish we were. And this could bring us there if we could have a sort of an adult, reasonable conversation about the policy priorities, but also not this chicken little skies falling about the debt issue. So we'll see, to be determined. It's a contingent reality. We'll know more about it in the next couple of weeks as we get closer to these deadlines.
Right. It's value added stuff. Like healthcare adds value to your economy. The CDC says people that have health insurance can be up to like 30% more productive at work. That adds money. Tax cuts do not stimulate the economy. This has been proven for decades. Wars forever also do not stimulate the grand economy. They make a lot of money for defense contractors and can make a bunch of money for people that have stocks in Halliburton, but that's about it. It doesn't reify out. So if it's time to really double down and spend money, this is where the money should go. It's popular too. That's the other thing. This is all very popular. So it'll be interesting to see if it gets through.
Our next topic for this week, is the voting rights bill and filibuster reform. So I thought this was a really important one. It's, there's a lot of other things going on right now, and this one's slightly under the radar, but it's still, there was a very prominent article that came out in the last few days from Rolling Stone magazine, of all places, where they got 3 White House insiders off the record, I think. I think that's the aegis under which this all came out, but they consider it verifiable, that they're saying that President Biden and the vice president have made it clear that getting the voting rights bill is a crucial priority. And they've got senior people across many departments working on it currently, with the intention of supporting selected filibuster reform to make it happen. Because as we all know, the Republican leadership doesn't really want to pass anything except for tax cuts these days, and with minimal exceptions to that, but certainly not a voting rights bill, especially in this context of the post-President Trump stop the steal catastrophe, January 6th catastrophe. Voting rights are in jeopardy right now. I think I saw a quote that 18 states have passed 30 bills restricting access to the polls. But that said, up until now, the president has not supported efforts to eliminate the filibuster, which that is the only option. So whether it was the John Lewis Voting Rights Act or the For the People Act or some let's call it a compromise bill that Senator Manchin is championing right now on behalf of the president. I think he said, look, if you're the one who's going to be the holdout, I want to make you the point person, and you go talk to Republicans and you tell them we've got priorities. We're going to put something in place. What's it going to be? So part of the this picture too is that Senator Clyburn, he was, let's call it, I don't want to say the driving force, but certainly when he came on board supporting President Biden in the last election, that was the switch in time that saved Biden, so to speak, and pivoted away from Bernie. So rather than get super deep into the weeds on this, I'll just say that he's also fighting for this, and he's got a credit with the Biden administration that's like a golden chip. The president has to move forward on behalf of Clyburn on this. And and like you said, this is also popular. There are a great many advantageous elements of it, like ending gerrymandering and through voting commissions, line redistricting commissions like we have here in California already. A whole slew of ways to expand the franchise instead of diminish the franchise. And so it's a high priority for a lot of organizations out there. So I'm gonna sort of give you a softball here. Do you think, and not to pigeonhole your answer, but do you think that this is gonna be a thing where there will be a select filibuster rollback carve out because of the priority and importance of voting rights in this country?
I really hope so. I really hope so. I think the Democrats are way behind on this. The number that you talked about, 18 states have passed 30 bills. That's from New York University's Brennan Center for Justice, and it really speaks to what we talked about last time I was here, the American Legislative Exchange Commission and their state-by-state effort to get laws passed that, enact a conservative agenda nationwide without winning major elections. And I think that we see the stranglehold on America's state legislatures all across this country, and they're all responding, as you said, to Trump's lie about the stolen election. There's zero evidence suggesting that our elections are not safe in the ways that they claim. And as I said last time, zero evidence that says that the proposals that they're offering will have any positive effect. They are only rolling back the most important franchise that we have in this country, which is our ability to vote. And this is the only effort the Democrats have made to respond that has any hope. So I think it is essential. The question that I have for you, though, is do you think it matters that Biden is showing up now? We were talking very briefly before we started rolling tonight that I feel like he's already a lame duck president. I do not feel like he has the kind of push through power that the Obama administration had. And I don't know that this really matters. I think folks like Sinema and them are just going to, like, they can afford to withstand the withering criticism of Joe Biden, right? Like, he's not bringing too much urgency to this fight, even if he's all in. Is that fair?
Your criticism, is it fair? Well,
yeah.
I would say that it's certainly arguable and viable as an outcome. So I made this comment about the Taliban's leadership, air quotes, like all contingent realities are possible. We don't really know. But that said, ... And that's how I feel about this. So I'm going to take a half step back and evade and then dive back in. So taking a half step back, what is the criticism here? Like what is the most obvious thing that, say, a Manchin or for that matter, Senator McConnell would even say? And one of the things I'm hearing is that you're federalizing elections and you're shifting control away from the states. And sort of by definition, Republicans prefer much more, well, when it suits their needs, they prefer that the control be at the state level. So that's the big picture. Is that
and
true?
They say that we will want the filibuster if we are ever the minority again, right? That old argument that we'll need it someday and all of that.
Yeah, exactly. And so you got organizations out there. This is a quote from Heritage Action. The executive director, her name is Jessica Anderson. She says, what we're talking about isn't just a Senate procedure. It's a complete takeover of our elections, which will ultimately destroy the American people's confidence in fair elections. So that's bluster and empty. I mean, that to me, that's not a reason. That's purely posturing.
We call it power tagging in debate.
Yeah, there you go.
It up. Yep. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so it's hype. It's hype, right? But so the question of filibuster, I actually heard one of the senators from Oregon last night. I'm trying to remember which one. Oh my goodness. But it doesn't matter. So basically saying, look, this is a priority. We you don't have to be a progressive. Just as a moderate American senator, like the reality of the situation is that you can't allow the minority to keep the Senate a hostage for a generation. And that's sort of where we're at, is that the McConnell Senate leadership, he showed while they were the majority. No, it's the other one. Sorry, it's the other senator. Producer's trying to help me, but it's
not
the other
why
one.
We have established Murley.
Murley. I thought there was a K in there, but yes, Senator Murley. So he's the one, and it was articulate. And there you go, Merkley. There is a K in there. I was right. So realistically, I mean, we got to find that recording and play it back and assess it, because I think that he was right on, and I think that's sort of where we need to start this conversation for people who are kind of on the fence. That's a key thing, is that we can't have the minority stop the majority in all agenda setting and all things moving forward. It just it's a know nothing or do nothing Congress if your sole function is to block everything like that. So but he said it way more articulate than I did. Mm-hmm. But one other thing I want to bounce off you, though, too. I know we all have limited time. This is like kind of rapid fire here. But yeah, there you go, on cue. So the idea that we are going to defend the filibuster because it's part of our founding fathers' vision is wrong. It's not a founding father vision. It really evolved over time. We in a prior show we talked about the history of it, but its main function was to help block civil rights. It's been used. I mean, you might have this stuff in the back of your mind. I'll let you roll with it. But it's mostly been used to block civil rights up until the modern era. So it would be appropriate, at the very least, I would argue, to roll it back for this purpose. I'll leave it to you to comment on that.
No, it's a really good point. It's anti-democratic in a lot of the wrong ways. We talk a lot about Mr. Smith Goes to Washington and the power that Jimmy Stewart has over the American imagination. And when we hear minority rights and states' rights, like that's who we think of, is that guy up there fighting the fight. But if you ask political scientists and you ask critical rhetoricians what we mean when we hear states' rights and minority rights in this country, we are definitely talking about the rights of slaveholders. We're talking about the folks that are trying to do some of the worst things possible to our environment, to have absolutely zero ramifications for that. Their minority rights are the ones that historically we see associated with this. Ted Cruz famously read Green Eggs and Ham while we debated the American Care Act, which continues to be one of the most substantial improvements to our healthcare system that we have seen in decades. And so I think that you're right on that. The history bears that out. For people to say this is like chopping the arm off of, the Constitution or something, it's just more bad history and bluster, as you've said. So I don't know. I do hope that they pass the reforms to move on this, but I think that they have enough cover to say that it's not that big of a deal to wait. And I think that I worry that Biden's not enough. I worry that he doesn't. That the presidency packs a punch, but I don't know that Biden is swinging for the fences. Mixing metaphors all day here.
Yeah.
We'll keep at it.
So I'll give you. I feel like I avoided that answer, and I'm going to give you one sentence back.
Yeah.
Is that Biden's been playing good cop here, and you don't project bad cop, and bad cop is always a possibility.
Yeah.
And Manchin doesn't want to be in the crosshairs of bad cop. Nobody does.
Sure.
After 20 years, $1 trillion spent training and equipping hundreds of thousands of Afghan national security and defense forces, 2,448 Americans killed, and untold thousands coming home with unseen trauma to their mental health.
I go to bed at night thinking about the families that have lost loved ones over there, and in addition, the Americans we left, the allies we abandoned.
U.S. service members in Kabul did heroic work, securing the airport, protecting civilians of many nationalities, including tens of thousands of Afghans, and airlifting them out. We've seen pictures of U.S. service members at the Kabul airport cradling babies, comforting families.
We now have Americans stuck in Afghanistan, the Taliban in charge, with more weaponry than they've ever had in the past.
All right, we're going to move on to the next topic this week, which is California mask mandates in the LA school system and California college systems.
Vaccine mandates too, right? Like that's the big one.
Yeah, so I'll let you, if you don't mind introducing this topic. This is something that I know is near and dear to your heart. You're extremely knowledgeable in here. Let's let you kind of lay down the groundwork of kind of where we are right now in California when it comes to these mandates vis-a-vis the rest of the country.
Yeah, well, we were talking with our producer, Matt Knight, beforehand about how you see like straight up party lines drawn in COVID infection rates in this country. Like you can literally map Trump's win based on the infection rates that we see. And you've got a situation where some states, that we have talked about quite a bit here on this show, have been doing everything they can to get in the way of mask mandates, to defund schools, to cause headaches and other kinds of stoppages with schools if they're trying to just enforce basic science to fight this. And then you see other states that are trying to do the right thing and vaccinate folks and get folks to mask up so we can get back to school. And what this is just a very, very large step in that direction. California, obviously one of the biggest, most substantial political forces in this country in a lot of ways, just because of the sheer volume of people we are talking about. Los Angeles County schools are prepared to require vaccines For students 12 and up, that's roughly 600,000 students in the Los Angeles school district are going to be implicated by this. And we also see vaccines being required across the CSU systems as we go back to in-person teaching in the spring. And what's really, really interesting about this to me is that you have quite a bit of holdout. You have quite a bit of vaccine hesitancy amongst young folks, liberal and conservative, for various reasons, which most of which, as I understand it, the evidence does not support. And what happens then when we require these mandates and we require vaccines is that you see a very, very large dropout rate. And that can have really catastrophic outcomes, less so for like publicly funded like K through 12 systems, although it definitely impacts those systems, but absolutely for the CSU. We're seeing enrollment declines already. And so when we require, like the CSU is between a rock and a hard place. If they do not require vaccines, then we cannot go back to in-person learning. And Zoom University is getting it done, but it is not the same. And everyone understands that. And so if you require vaccines, then you get the vaccine hesitancy folks that are going to drop out, and that really hits those enrollment rates. And so it's just another really fascinating instance where politics and healthcare are going kind of head to head. We see the same blowback in California. I'm curious. We situate this state as like a deep blue state, but I've talked on this show a bit about how I feel like it's a little purpler than that. Like, do you see this blowback? Are you worried about the same kind of blowback in the state of California that we see at other places? Maybe not at administrative level, but at like the grassroots level.
Yeah, so I would say all great points, and thank you for framing this. One of the images that I saw this week that really hit home, and it's a little bit of a non sequitur, but it had to do with the recall, and it had to do with the messaging, the campaign expenditures that were done on behalf of keeping the governor in office versus unseating him, basically saying that Trump's right, everything that goes against Trump is terrible, and we need to put someone like Trump in as the governor, sort of thing. Vaccines are bad and masks are bad. The COVID shutting down the economy was bad. All that anti-Governor Newsom rhetoric. The way they spent their dollars, so it was 40 or 50 million on one side and 20, 30 million on the other, a lot of money on digital advertising. But if you look, one message went to the coasts, and the vast majority of the Democratic, pro-Gavin money went to the coast to say, COVID was a public health pandemic. We dealt with it within, public health guidelines. We mitigated the impact to public health. We mitigated the impact on the economy, and then we're doing great. Our tax base is up, and things are, even though it's a terrible time, things aren't going too badly. Versus the other side, where the anti-Gavin money was spent on the inner empire, like all the other counties that aren't on the coast or big city. That's where all their money went, and it was all about this, shutting down the economy was terrible, putting on masks as a violation of freedom, forcing people to take vaccines as a violation of freedom. This is the end of the world as you know it, because you have this guy in there as the governor. So I mean, I'm oversimplifying, but it was a tale of two cities. And so I don't know if it's so much as purple as it is just geography, socioeconomic status, education level, and culture, kind of this hodgepodge of traits that really it's like a tale of two cities, just to kind of reiterate that. And I think that kind of plays out. Like, I talk to people in Texas, I talk to people in Florida, and they say, well, my governor's not doing too bad of a job. I'm like, what are you talking about? Like, what about this and this and this? And they're like, well, but that's what the people want him to do. Mm-hmm. So there's that element of it, which is like within California, there's a whole bunch of people that don't want the governor to do what he's doing. But the problem is that they only represent about a third of 25% of the population, which, that's like 8%. And I've heard some people say it's even less than that, who are really the strong voices here. But let's get back to like the mandates themselves. President Biden recently put out that mandate that all federal workers and contractors, and there's a long list of folks, right, companies with over 100 people. And I'm not sure if it's the OSHA requirements are going to stand up in court. I hear that they are. Mm-hmm. I hear that that's a legit exercise of power, because you can't force people to go to work in a place that's unsafe. So therefore, this is public health best practice. So I'm just going to ask you, what are your thoughts on the president being able to use this extraordinary power within, say, safe workspace? So for teachers and for healthcare workers, it seems like a no-brainer for teachers and healthcare workers. But do you think that this traction that he is attempting to get might get refuted in courts, or might cause, I hate to say it like this, but again, we're ripping scabs off left and right on this show. I saw a T-shirt that said something like "I plead the second," which it's basically just like, look, I'm not going to speak my mind because it'll put me in a bad place. But ... So is it going to be? There's another insurrection moment coming up this weekend, in theory.
Yep.
So what are your thoughts on sort of this pushback, this culture war that is a highly divisive political posturing?
Well, the next topic is going to be about a Robert E. Lee statue coming down in Charlottesville, so I feel like it's going to be just a really, really easy segue. But it's interesting because I feel like Biden potentially there's an overstep with some of the younger populations. I had talked here a little bit about how some of the conversations I've had and research I've done talks about how like emergency mandates for vaccines for the populations that we've talked about, nurses, healthcare workers, those folks, makes a lot of sense, especially because of their proximity. And also because of their vulnerability. Young folks and children statistically are far less vulnerable. That's not to say that there are not consequences, but there are absolutely statistically in a much safer category, so far as we know, than any other population that we're talking about here. And especially with the vaccine shortages that we have, requiring it for folks as young as 12 is possibly premature. It's not necessarily dangerous. It's just not putting our resources where they could potentially be at the best use. Biden is going to try to protect every American that he can because he's the president, and we are leading the world in like sending vaccines out, but we could be doing more, and that's one instance where we're probably not putting our resources where they belong. You mentioned that OSHA is there to protect people at work. It's also there to protect people from dangerous jobs. If you're a construction company and you're going to be holding bricks over a sidewalk, that can be dangerous to the people on the scaffolding, but it can also be dangerous for the people down below. And that's exactly what we're talking about here when we talk about a pandemic, and that's exactly the consequence that we see. The people that are refusing to get vaccinated are absolutely the massive 90% of the people that end up in the emergency rooms and in the healthcare systems. And it's not so much that this creates, a crisis when they give it to everyone else, but it overstresses our healthcare systems. It comes to a point where you can't get necessary surgery or even elective operations done because our healthcare systems are overstressed. It's based on profitability, not on need and demand. And so I think that in this instance, they're going to challenge it in court. Of course they are. But I feel like there's really, really strong support for, this kind of limits. Whether or not it dovetails into more insurrectionist activity, that to me, I think is very likely. I think a lot of people are using the vaccine rhetoric the same way that they used pretty much everything that Barack Obama did to say that the war has begun and that they want to finish it.
Yeah, that's dark and bleak. So I'm going to try to end on a little positive here this segment. I know we have minimalist time. I did see that I think it was Pfizer has announced that they're doing testing on even younger kids. Yep. So that they expect to have an announcement by sometime in October that I think 5 to 12 are going to be eligible sometime soon. Like you said, public health numbers show that it's not going to eliminate or mitigate them getting sick very much because it's such a low probability event. But it's that group, the 30s and the 40s and the 50s, who are now getting hit much, much harder. And I think that getting kids vaccines could help with the vectors. So we'll pick up on this again as that announcement comes out. All right, that takes us to our fifth topic, our final topic, the Robert E. Lee statue removal from Richmond, Virginia. I definitely wanted to talk about this with you as soon as I saw the article, so I'm really glad we have this chance. It's truly a historic event, and I'm going to try to cram in some history. I'll talk fast. So Richmond was the capital of the Confederacy. This was a 21-foot bronze statue on a 40-foot pedestal, put up in place in 1890 during Reconstruction, the Jim Crow era of legalized segregation. Robert E. Lee was the most prominent general of the Confederacy, the top Southern general of the Civil War. Since last summer, this monument had become a hub of social justice protest, and there were several clashes with police. After Charlottesville white supremacy rally in 2017 and the George Floyd killings, during the protests of last summer. This was just a very, very hyped up target. 5 other statues were already removed, so this one was just a question of when. But it had uncertain legal status because the original agreement from back in Reconstruction era stipulated the state of Virginia was going to be the custodian in perpetuity. So there was a legal argument that the state had to babysit this statue at this spot forever. But the Supreme Court of Virginia, I'll leave it after this quote, Supreme Court of Virginia decided that the circumstances that were in place when that agreement was signed are no longer accurate. The state cannot be expected to uphold its end of the deal given the reality on the ground, and therefore the terms of the agreement are no longer in force. So last Monday, a week ago Monday, Governor Northam announced he would carry out the removal, and within a day they took it down. So that's the backstory. It was highly contentious, and it seemed almost inevitable that it would go, but they were holding on. And I'm going to ask you, how much of that is, how will that reverberate, you think, and how will it be perceived? And that's kind of my softball to you about how you think this will play out.
It's kind of a reverberation in and of its own self, right? Like I mentioned Charlottesville in the prior segment because they have also taken down 2 statues, including one with Robert E. Lee. But the Richmond one is the one we want to talk about for sure because it is so substantial. That's the one that was nearly 6 stories or whatever on its pedestal. And then you've got like all of these statues coming down in multiple places. And it's important. We removed a McKinley statue here in Arcata famously, one of the only instances that indigenous folks have managed to get a presidential statue removed from a public space, by the way, which was really fascinating to read when that happened. And the debate team spent quite a bit of time researching statues and how they work. And as a rhetorician, it is very important, the things that we memorialize. Like, what do we memorialize and how do we memorialize those things? It organizes the stories that we tell, and those have tremendous political power, and that's why we build these statues in the first place. As you mentioned, this was built during Reconstruction. Most of the Confederate statues that we see came out during the Civil Rights Movement and the lead up there too, as a kind of like last gasp for the so-called lost cause. It's being received very predictably. I think a lot of people are wrapped up in the mythos of Robert E. Lee. Robert E. Lee was, I said, a Southern gentleman in all of the wrong ways. He was absolutely a strident slaveholder. He was a patriot for the United States until he wasn't. People may know John Brown. He led a violent uprising against the United States in order to liberate enslaved folks, took over an entire armory, and it was Robert E. Lee that brought that down with Stonewall Jackson in tow. So you've got, an individual whose record is very clear. As a military leader, he had some spectacular wins. But again, as we talked about before, we rolled just an entire summer of getting completely destroyed by Ulysses S. Grant before he ever surrendered, which really, again, speaks to that kind of chivalrous notion of the Southern gentleman who's going to fight to the very last, no matter how helpless it is. He's definitely not someone we should be idolizing in this country. And yet he is like bigger I saw someone say once he's like the Confederate Abraham Lincoln. Jefferson Davis never captivated the imagination of the Confederacy the way that Robert E. Lee did. And so I think it's very substantial that this statue came down. Do you think that we're going to see this conversation continue? Like, there's some major ones. I don't know that it's ever possible, but Mount Rushmore, the person that built like the Confederate statue that, preceded Mount Rushmore. It is on indigenous land, sacred land, the Black Hills and all of that. We're never going to go as far as like demolishing Mount Rushmore. But do you think that we're going to see other major statues come down in major places?
I really do. I think that this. So let's talk about McKinleyville. Sorry, it's in Arcata, but the McKinley statue.
Right.
When I first heard about it, I thought, maybe we should just build another statue, something nicer, more reflective of our values as a community. Point to that other one as a historic monument, and that's probably okay. I heard similar things coming out of Richmond, Virginia over the last couple of years. They're like, look, just build something different, build a museum or, something. But I've pivoted, I think, just based on some of the reflection over the last year. I do understand why it's so critical for folks. And I saw a quote I'm going to share with you from the New York Times. on this topic. The battle over Civil War memory is as old as the war itself. At its root is a power struggle over who has the right to decide how history is remembered. It's painful because it involves the most traumatic event the nation has ever experienced, and one that is still to some extent unprocessed, largely because the South came up with its own version of the war. Like you said earlier, that it was the noble fight for states' rights, not slavery. So that's still going on, and we're seeing it play out in the insurrection movement. It's still, like you said, there, it wasn't just this last gasp of the Confederacy in the 1960s when, in the 1950s we put God in everything and on everything. It's still going on. And one of those concepts that people are fighting back against is called critical race theory. Oh my God, you're teaching this in my schools. But really, one of the principles of that is historic patterns of racism are ingrained in law and other modern institutions, and what version of America's story is told. So it's still, it goes back to the story. It goes back to the culture. It goes back to the heritage, the things that these folks are pointing at. And I'm going to quote from The Guardian here. There was a Black Lives Matter supporter who was asked about, he showed up for this removal and they asked him what he thought. And he said, "It's time for us to be honest about our history. Germany has 0 statues of Hitler or Rommel. They learned the lesson and we have to learn the lesson. We cannot coddle white supremacy in this country." And I have to say, I wish it wasn't so. I wish this wasn't even a thing, but it is a thing. And we have to have those uncomfortable conversations. And I think that's happening in churches and living rooms and dinner tables around the country, but particularly in the South right now. They're being forced to process something that they've been refusing to process for generations. I have friends, I have family, and there are a lot of folks who have to work through it. But when you look at your other friends and your other family and your peers, and then they're just like, it's time. It's really time. I'll give you love. Yeah, you get the love, but it's time to process. So I'm hopeful that we continue these conversations at wherever they take us.
As someone who teaches critical race theory in the schools, I will absolutely tell you that one of the things we have taken from this entire branch of academia is how important the ongoing discussion is. And that is the primary solvent mechanism that most of these books are going to talk about. It's not necessarily going to be tearing down every single statue, although there's a lot on why that is important. It's going to be having reflexive conversations about things that we've overlooked, like white supremacy hides in plain sight. White folks especially don't feel it. And so to walk by statues every day and to just think of it as a statue is a kind of privilege. And it's one that I share. And it's one that takes reflection. We have to stop and realize that stories affect different people in different ways. And that just because we don't understand why something is harmful, that doesn't mean it isn't doing a tremendous amount of harm. And this is the vocabulary that we get from the kind of critical rhetoric side of critical race theory, where if you put someone who fought to maintain the institutions of enslavement on this country on a massive horse looking like a hero, then we cannot say that we're beyond racism or that we've solved racism, because that celebrates that legacy. And people are harmed by that legacy in very, very meaningful ways. So it's a fascinating conversation, and one that as a rhetorician I especially get really, really excited about. I'm very excited about history. I think the ways that we remember history are super important. And so I hope this is a conversation that really continues.
And one last thought and reflection on this too is there is a place for history in its ugliness, and it's called a museum.
Yeah, I don't want the statue there either. But yeah, that's the argument you hear quite a bit is, and yeah, people say we're going to forget this history, but that's not what statues are for. Statues aren't there as the last bit of opportunity to remember something. Statues are there to glorify the stuff that we really want to celebrate. No one builds a statue to like a statue isn't a sticky note that says make sure you remember sugar at the grocery store, right? It's something that's celebrating something substantial.
Now it's time for predictions. I'll let you go first. What is your prediction for this week?
So I kind of tipped my hand on this last time, but I said that I think that if Newsom survives the recall, he's going to be a candidate for president, and more and than ever, I think that's true. And I just have this strange feeling that he's going to share a ticket with Stacey Abrams. I don't know who's going to be the Veep candidate. I think that the patriarchy will probably win out on that, but That's my prediction. Is that I've said it before. I do not think Biden is going to run for re-election, and I do think that Kamala Harris is going to be out in the cold after it's over. It's kind of a multifaceted prediction, but there it is. What do you think, David? What's cooking?
So the thing that kind of made it onto my radar this week was that Senator Manchin has skeletons in his closet. Not only are they personal, that he's an oil patch kid, we all knew that, but his family is also a pharmaceutical patch family, and there's talk. I don't have firsthand knowledge of this, but there's talk that there were leaked emails that his daughter was involved in colluding with Pfizer to drive up the price of the EpiPen, and colluding with other organizations to have them placed in schools and stockpiles of triple price EpiPens bought by schools all over the country. Just plain old corruption. Nothing out of the ordinary. Just throw your weight around, make money. But that there's, to a certain extent, legal questions in their on their lap, their family, and certainly smear. Smearing is not being conducted by mainstream media, thankfully, yet, but it's starting to leak out. So that said, this dirty carrots and sticks. So the carrots and sticks conversation is about how to get Manchin to do what we want. I suspect that there's backroom conversations about all the potential crimes and all the potential bad press that would fall upon his family if he were not to be a team player, and that he's basically going to be presented with what is your minimum level of comfort. Where will you cut on the filibuster? Where will you cut on the spending bill? And what is it that you need? So I think we're going to see a passage of both the budget reconciliation bill and of the voting rights filibuster clawback based on just insider power politics.
I want you to be right. I just really want you to be right, David. Fingers crossed that you're right.
Yeah, it's just a hunch. Well, yeah. Thank you very much, Aaron. This was great this week. Thanks for joining us. I really appreciate your time and your insights, and I look forward to connecting with you again in future weeks. That's
always appreciated. Yep.
Right on, man. That's it for Redwood Wonk tonight. Take care, and we'll see you again next week.